Series of Unfortunate Events, Part 1, Bad Beginning. So far, it's been pretty bad. If there's a series of these bad things, it's going to be probably not a good thing, right? I guess that makes sense. Um, so, leading up to this point, we met the kids Violet, Klaus, Sunny, Baudelaire's. We've met Mr. Poe, we met Justice Strauss. Mr. Poe is kind of in between guy character, we don't hate him, we don't like him. Justice Strauss we like a lot, and then we've met Count Olaf and his theater troupe, which we just despise. They're evil people. Count Olaf is after the kids' money that they inherited when their parents died in a house fire. His house is weird, strange. It has eyeballs are all over it. He has a tattoo of an eyeball. What else? Oh, and then he now has got the kids to he kidnap Sunny, put her in a tower in a bird cage hanging really high up, and threatened to have her drop if Violet doesn't marry him for real. That they found out during the play that Ariel Stick is fake. When he does that, he gets her money. But when we stopped, Violet was tying her hair back into a ponytail, and she does that when she has an idea and she's really thinking hard. And that's where we left off. So we have about 4 more chapters left. We're going to finish that today. We'll see how this ends. Chapter 10. That night, Klaus was the Baudelaire orphan sleeping fitfully in bed, and Violet was the Baudelaire orphan staying up, working by the light of the moon. All day the two siblings had wandered around the house, doing the assigned chores and scarcely speaking to each other. Klaus was too tired and despondent to speak, and Violet was holed up in the inventing area of her mind, too busy planning to talk. When night approached, Violet gathered up the curtains that had been Sunny's bed and brought them to the door to the tower stairs, where the enormous assistant of Count Olaf, the one who looked like neither a man nor a woman, was standing guard. Violet asked whether she could bring the blankets to her sister to make her more comfortable during the night. The enormous creature merely looked at Violet with its blank white eyes and shook its head, then dismissed her with her silent gesture. Violet knew, of course, that Sunny was too terrified to be comforted by a handful of draperies, but she hoped that she would be allowed a few moments to hold her and tell her that everything would turn out all right. Also, she wanted to do something known in the crime industry as casing the joint. Casing the joint means observing a particular location in order to formulate a plan. For instance, if you are a bank robber, although I hope you aren't, you might go to the bank a few days before you planned to rob it. Perhaps, wearing a disguise, you would look around the bank, observe security guards, cameras, and other obstacles, so you could plan how to avoid capture or death during your burglary. Robbery, let's say it that way. Violet, a law-abiding citizen, was not planning to rob a bank, but she was planning to rescue Sunny and was hoping to catch a glimpse of the tower room in which her sister was being held prisoner, so as to make her plan more easily. But it appeared that she wasn't going to be able to case the joint after all. This made Violet nervous, as she sat on the floor by the window working on her invention as quietly as she could. Violet had a very few materials into which to invent something, and she didn't want to wander around the house looking for more for fear of arousing the suspicions of Count Olaf and his troop. But she had enough to build a rescuing device. Above the window was a sturdy metal rod from which the curtains had hung, and Violet took it down. Using one of the rocks Olaf had left in a pile in the corner, she broke the curtain rod into 2 pieces, and then she bent each piece of the rod into several sharp angles, leaving tiny cuts on her hands as she did so. Then Violet took down the painting of the eye. On the back of the painting, as on the back of many paintings, was a small piece of wire to hang on the hook. She removed the wire and used it to connect the 2 pieces together. Violet had now made what looked like a large metal spider, and then she went over to the cardboard box and put out the ugliest of the clothes that Mr. Poe had purchased, the outfit that the Baudelaire orphans would never wear, no matter how desperate they were. Working quickly and quietly, she began to tear these into long, narrow strips and to tie these strips together. Among Violet's many useful skills was the vast knowledge of different types of knots. The particular knot she was using was called the devil's tongue. A group of female Finnish pirates invented it back in the 15th century and named it the Devil's Tongue because it's twisted this way and that in a most complicated and eerie way. The Devil's Tongue was a very useful knot, and when Violet tied the cloth strips together, end to end, it formed a sort of a rope. As she worked, she remembered something her parents had said to her when Klaus was born, and again when they brought Sonny home from the hospital. You are the eldest Baudelaire child, they said kindly but firmly, and as the eldest, it will always be your responsibility to look after your younger siblings. Promise us that you will always watch out for them and make sure they don't get into trouble. Violet remembered her promise and thought of Klaus, whose bruised face still looked sore, and Sonny dangling from the top of a tower like a flag, and began working faster. Even though Count Olaf was, of course, the cause of all this misery, Violet felt as if she had broken her promise to her parents and vowed to make it right. Eventually, using enough of the ugly clothing, Violet had a rope that was, she hoped, just over 30 feet long. She tied one end of it to a metal spider and looked at her handiwork. What she had made was called a grappling hook, which is something used for climbing up the side of buildings, usually for a nefarious purpose. Using the metal end of to hook onto something at the top of the tower and the rope to aid her climb, Violet hoped to reach the top of the tower, untie Sonny's cage, climb back down. This was, of course, a very risky plan, both because it was dangerous and because she had made the grappling hook herself instead of purchasing it at a store that sold such things. But a grappling hook was all Violet could think of to make without proper inventing laboratory, and time was running short. She had told Klaus about her plan because she didn't want to give him false hope, so without waking him, she gathered up her grappling hook and tiptoed out the room. Once outside, Violet realized her plan was even more difficult than she thought. The night was quiet, which means she would have to make practically no noise at all. The night also had a slight breeze, and when she pictured herself swinging in the breeze, clinging to the rope made of ugly clothing, she almost gave up entirely. And the night was dark, so it was hard to see where she could toss the grappling hook and have the metal arm hook onto something. But standing there shivering in her nightgown, Violet knew she had to try. Using her right hand, she threw the grappling hook as high and hard as she could and waited to see if it would catch onto something. Clang! The hook made a loud noise as it hit the tower, but it didn't stick to anything and came crashing back down. Her heart pounding, Violet stood stock still, wondering if Count Olaf or one of his accomplices would come and investigate, but nobody arrived after a few moments, and Violet, swinging the hook over her head like a lasso, tried again. Clang, clang! The grappling hook hit the tower twice as it bounced back down to the ground. Violet waited again, listening for footsteps, and all she heard was her own terrified pulse. She decided to try one more time. Clang! The grappling hook hit the tower and fell down again, hitting Violet hard in the shoulder. One of the arms tore her nightgown and cut through her skin. Biting down on her hand to keep from crying out in pain, Violet felt the place in her shoulder where she had been struck, and it was wet with blood. Her arm throbbed in pain. At this point in the proceedings, if I were Violet, I would have given up, but she was just about to turn around and go inside the house. She pictured how scared Sonny must be, and ignoring the pain in her shoulder, Violet used her right hand to throw the hook again. Clut! The usual clang sound stopped halfway through. Violet saw in the dim light of the moon that the hook wasn't falling. Nervously, she gave the rope a good yank, and it stayed put. The grappling hook had worked. Her feet touching the side of the stone tower, and her hands grasping the rope, Violet closed her eyes and began to climb, never daring to look around. She pulled herself up the tower, hand over hand, all the time keeping in mind her promise to her parents and the horrible thing Count Olaf would do if his villainous plan worked. The evening wind blew harder and harder as she climbed higher and higher, and several times Violet had stopped climbing as the rope moved in the wind. She was certain that at any moment the cloth would tear or the hook would slip and Violet would be tumbling to her death. But thanks to her adroit inventing skills, the word adroit means skillful, everything worked the way it was supposed to work, and suddenly Violet felt herself feeling a piece of metal instead of cloth, and she opened her eyes and saw her sister, who was looking at her frantically, trying to say something in the past the strip of tape. Violet had arrived at the top of the tower. right at the window where Sunny was tied. The eldest Baudelaire orphan was about to grab her sister's cage between her and begin her descent when she saw something that made her stop. It was the spidery end of the grappling hook, which after several attempts had finally stuck onto something on the tower. Violet had guessed during her climb that it had found some notch in the stone, or part of the window, or perhaps a piece of furniture inside the tower room and stuck there. But that wasn't what the hook had stuck on. Violet's grappling hook had stuck on another hook. It was one of the hooks on the hook man's hand, and his other hook, Violet saw, was glinting in the moonlight as he reached towards her. All right, so the end of that chapter. What happened? First, what was Violet's plan to save her sister? Right, she invented a grappling hook. She threw it up to the top of the tower and climbed up. It was a very dangerous plan. And she almost gave up after it fell 3 times and then one time hit her. But she didn't give up. She kept going. Did it work? Did she make it to the top of the tower? Yep, she made it all the way up there. She made it up to where Sunny was. But what unfortunate event happened? The grappling hook was attached to the hook man's hook, one of those hooks, and the other one was reaching out for her. Chapter 11. Let's see how this goes. How pleasant that you could join us, the hook-hand man said in a sickly sweet voice. Violet immediately tried to scurry back down the rope, but Count Olaf's assistance was too quick for her. In one movement, he hoisted her into the tower room and, with a flick of his hook, sent her rescue device clanging to the ground. Now Violet was trapped as her sister. I'm so glad you're here, the hook-handed man said. I was just thinking how I wanted to see your pretty face. Have a seat. What are you going to do with me? Violet asked. I said have a seat, the hook-handed man snarled and pushed her into a chair. Violet looked around the dim, messy room, and I'm certain that over the course of your own life you have noticed that people's rooms reflect their personalities. In my room, for instance, I've gathered a collection of objects that are important to me, including a dusty accordion on which I can play a few sad songs, a large bundle of notes on the activities of the Baudelaire orphans, and a blurry photograph taken a very long time ago of a woman whose name is Beatrice. These are items that are very precious and dear to me. The tower room held objects that were very dear and precious to Count Olaf, and they were terrible things. There were scraps of paper on which he had written his evil ideas in legible scrawl lying in messy piles on the top of the copy of natural law he had taken away from Klaus. There was a few chairs and a handful of candles which were giving off flickering shadows. Littered all over the floor were empty wine bottles and dirty dishes. But most of all were the drawings and painting and carvings of eyes, big and small, all over the room. They were eyes painted on the ceiling and scratched into the grimy wooden floors. There were eyes scrawled on the windowsill, one big eye painted on the knob of the door that led to the stairs. It was a terrible place. The hook-handed man reached into his pocket of the greasy overcoat and pulled out a walkie-talkie. With some difficulty, he pressed a button and waited a moment. Boss, it's me, he said. Your blushing bride just climbed up here to try to rescue the biting brat. He paused as Count Olaf said something. I don't know, some sort of rope. It was a grappling hook, Violet said, and tore off a sleeve of her nightgown to make a bandage for her shoulder. I made it myself. She says it was a grappling hook, the hookman said in the walkie-talkie. I don't know, boss. Yes, boss. Yes, boss. Of course I understand. She's yours. Yes, boss. He pressed a button to disconnect the line and then turned to face Violet. Count Olaf is very displeased with his bride. I'm not his bride, Violet said bitterly. You soon will be, the hook-handed man said, wagging his hook in the way most people would wag a finger. In the meantime, however, I have to go and fetch your brother. The 3 of you will be locked in this room until night falls. That way, Count Olaf can be sure you will all stay out of mischief. With that, the hook-handed man stomped out of the room. Violet heard the door lock behind him and then listened to his footsteps fading down the stairs. She immediately went over to Sunny and put a hand on her little head, afraid to untie or untape her sister for fearing of accruing a word which here means bringing about. Count Olaf's wrath. Violet stroked Sunny's hair and murmured that everything will be all right. But of course, everything was not all right. Everything was all wrong. As the first light of morning trickled into the tower room, Violet reflected on all the awful things she and her siblings had experienced recently. Their parents had died suddenly and horribly. Mr. Poe had brought them ugly. Mrs. Poe had bought them ugly clothing. They had moved into Count Olaf's house and were treated terribly. Mr. Poe had refused to help them. They had discovered a fiendish plot involving marrying Violet and stealing the Baudelaire fortune. Klaus had tried to confront Olaf with knowledge he had learned in Joseph Strauss' library and failed. Poor Sunny had been captured, and now Violet had tried to rescue Sunny and found herself captured as well. All in all, the Baudelaire orphans had encountered catastrophe after catastrophe, and Violet found their situation lamentably deplorable. A phrase here which means it was not at all enjoyable. The sound of footsteps coming up the stairs brought Violet out of her thoughts, and soon the hook-handed man opened the door and thrust a very tired, confused, and scared Klaus into the room. "Here's the last orphan," the hook-handed man said, "and now I must go help Count Olaf with the final preparations for tonight's performance. No monkey business, you two, or I will have to tie you up and let you dangle out of the window as well." Glaring at them, he locked the door again and tromped downstairs. Klaus blinked and looked around the filthy room. He was still in his pajamas. "What has happened?" he asked Violet. "Why are we up here?" "I tried to rescue Sunny," Violet said, "using an invention of mine to climb up the tower." Klaus went over to the window and looked down at the ground. "It's so high up," he said. "You must have been terrified." "It was very scary," she admitted, "but not as scary as the thought of marrying Count Olaf. I'm sorry your invention didn't work," Klaus said sadly. "The invention worked fine," Violet said, rubbing her shoulder. "I just got caught, and now we're doomed." The hook-handed man said he'd keep us here until tonight, and then it was the marvelous marriage. "Do you think you could invent something that could help us escape?" Klaus asked, looking around the room. "Maybe," Violet said, "and why don't you go through those books and papers? Perhaps there's something that could be of use." For the next few hours, Violet and Klaus searched the room and in their own minds for anything that might have helped them. Violet looked for objects which she could invent something. Klaus read through Count Olaf's papers and books. From time to time, they would go over to Sunny and smile at her and pat her on the head to reassure her. Occasionally, Violet and Klaus would speak to each other, but mostly they were silent and lost in their own thoughts. "If we had any kerosene," Violet said around noon, "I could make a Molotov cocktail with these bottles." "What are Molotov cocktails?" Klaus asked. "They are small bombs made inside of bottles," Violet explained. "You can throw them out the window and attract the attention of passerbys." "But we don't have any kerosene," Klaus said mournfully. They were silent for several hours. "If we were polygamists," Klaus said, "Count Olaf's marriage plan wouldn't work." "What are polygamists?" Violet asked. "Polygamists are people who marry more than one person," Klaus explained. "In this community, polygamists are breaking the law, even if they have married in the presence of a judge, with the statement of 'I do' and the signed document in their own hand. I read it here in nuptial law." "But we're not polygamists," Violet said mournfully. They were silent for several more hours. "We could break these bottles in half," Violet said, "and use them as knives, but I'm afraid that Count Olaf's troop would overpower us." "You could say 'I don't' instead of 'I do,'" Klaus said, "but I'm afraid Count Olaf would order Sunny dropped out of the tower." "I certainly would," Count Olaf said, and the children jumped. They had been so involved in their conversation that Dad had heard him come up the stairs and open the door. He was wearing a fancy suit, and his eyebrows had been waxed so that it looked as shiny as his eyes. Behind him stood the Hook Man, who smiled and waved a hook at the youngsters. "Come, orphan," Count Olaf said. "It's time for the big event. My associate here will stay behind in this room, and will keep the constant contact through our walkie-talkies. If anything goes wrong during tonight's performance, your sister will drop to her death. Come along now." Violet and Klaus looked at each other and then at Sunny, still dangling in her cage, and followed Count Olaf out the door. As Klaus walked down the tower stairs, he felt a heavy sinking in his heart, and as all of hope left him. There truly seemed to be no way out of their predicament. Violet was feeling the same way until she reached out with her right hand to grasp the banister for balance. She looked at her right hand for a second and began to think. All the way down the stairs and out the door, and the short walk down the block to the theater, Violet thought and thought and thought. harder than she had had in her entire life. Alrighty, so it's the end of that chapter. The kids were all trapped in the tower. They went down and got Klaus, brought him up, and they decided they were going to try to invent something or they'll read something that will help them out of this situation, this predicament. Did they find anything? No. Everything that they found wasn't going to help them. Even Violet thinking that just instead of saying I do, saying I don't. Because she said pretty much he would just have their sister dropped out of the tower. And he snuck up in there and said, yeah, he would. So he has an associate up there with the baby, and he is taking the other two kids to the theater so they can do their play, and he can marry Violet. But on the way down the stairs, Violet looked at her right hand for some reason. And she kept thinking about her right hand all the way down the stairs, down the road to the theater. Does she have a plan, maybe? But what would her plan do with her right hand? I guess we'll find out. So, chapter 12. As Violet and Klaus Baudelaire stood still in their nightgowns and pajamas backstage at Count Olaf's theaters, they were of two minds, a phrase here which here means they felt two different ways at the same time. On one hand, they were of course filled with dread. From the murmur of the voices they heard on the stage, the two Baudelaire orphans could tell that the performance of the marvelous marriage had begun, and it seemed too late to do anything to foil Count Olaf's plans. On the other hand, however, they were fascinated, as they had never been backstage at a theatrical production, and there was so much to see. Members of Count Olaf's theater troupe hurried this way and that, too busy to even glance at the children. 3 very short men were carrying a large flat piece of wood, painted to look like a living room. The 2 white-faced women were arranging flowers in a vase that from far away appeared to be marble, but close up looked more like cardboard. An important-looking man with warts all over his face was adjusting enormous light fixtures, and as the children peeked on stage, they could see Count Olaf in his fancy suit, claiming some lines from the play, just as the curtain came down, controlled by the woman with the very short hair who was pulling on a long rope attached to a pulley. Despite their fears, you see, the 2 older Baudelaires were very interested in what was going on, and only wished they were not involved in any way. As the curtain fell, Count Olaf strode off stage and looked at the children. It's the end of Act 2. Why aren't the orphans in their costumes? He hissed at the 2 white-faced women. Then, as the audience broke out into applause, his angry expression turned to one of joy, and he walked back on stage. Gesturing to a short-haired woman to raise the curtain, he strode to the exact center of the stage and took elaborate bows as the curtains came up. He waved and blew kisses to the audience as the curtain came down again, and then his face once again filled with anger. Intermission is only 10 minutes, he said, and then the children must perform. Get them into costume, quickly. Without a word, the 2 white-faced women grabbed Violet and Klaus by the wrist and led them to a dressing room. The room was dusty but shiny, covered in mirrors and tiny lights, so the actors could see better to put on their makeup and wigs, which they were people calling out to one another and laughing as they changed their clothes. One white-faced woman yanked Violet's arms up and pulled her nightgown off over her head and thrust a dirty, lacy white dress at her to put on. Klaus, meanwhile, had his pajamas removed by the other white-faced woman and was hurriedly stuffed into a blue sailor suit that itched and made him look like a toddler. Isn't this exciting? Said a voice, and the children turned to see Justice Strauss, all dressed up in her judge's robes and powdered wig. She was clutching a small book. You children look wonderful. So do you, Klaus said. What's that book? Why, those are my lines, Justice Strauss said. Count Olaf told me to bring a law book and read the real wedding ceremony in order to make the play as realistic as possible. All you have to say, Violet, is, I do. But I have to quite a speech. This is going to be such fun. You know what would be fun, Violet said carefully? It's if you changed your lines around just a little bit. Klaus' face lit up. Yes, Justice Strauss. Be creative. There's no reason to stick to the legal ceremony. It's not as if this is a real wedding. Justice Strauss frowned. I don't know about that, children, she said. I think it would be best to follow Count Olaf's instructions. After all, he's in charge. Justice Strauss, a voice called. Justice Strauss, please report to the makeup artist. Oh, my word, I get to wear makeup? Justice Strauss was on a dreamy expression as if she We're about to be crowned queen instead of just having some powder and cream smeared on our face. Children, I must go. See you on stage, my dears. Just as Strauss leaving the children to finish changing into their costumes, one white-faced woman put a flowered headdress on Violet, who realized in horror that the dress she had changed into was a bridal gown. The other woman put a sailor cap on Klaus, who gazed into one of the mirrors and astonished at how ugly he looked. His eyes met those of Violet, who was looking in the mirror as well. What can we do? Klaus said quietly. Pretend to be sick? Maybe they'll call off the performance. Count Olaf would know what we were up to, Violet replied glumly. Act 3 of The Marvelous Married by Al Funkoot is about to begin. A man with clipboard shouted, Everyone, please, get in your places for Act 3. The actors rushed out the door, and then white-faced women grabbed the children and hustled them out after them. The backstage area was in complete pandemonium, a word which here means actors and stagehands running around attending to last-minute details. The bald man with the long nose hurried by the children, then stopped himself to look at Violet in her wedding dress, and smirked. No funny stuff, he said to them, wagging a bony finger. Remember, when you go out there, just do exactly what you're supposed to do. Count Olaf will be holding his walkie-talkie during the entire act, and if you do even one thing wrong, he'll be giving Sonny a call up there in the tower. Yes, Klaus said bitterly. He was tired of being threatened the same way over and over. You better do exactly as planned, the man said again. I'm sure they will, said a voice suddenly, and the children turned to see Mr. Poe, dressed very formally and accompanied by his wife. He smiled at the children and came over to shake their hands. Polly and I just wanted to tell you to break a leg. What? Klaus said, alarmed. That's theater term, Mr. Poe explained, meaning good luck on tonight's performance. I'm glad that you children have adjusted to life with your new father and are participating in family activities. Mr. Poe, Klaus said quickly, Violet and I have something to tell you, and it's very important. What is it? Mr. Poe said. Yes, said Count Olaf. What is it you have to tell Mr. Poe, children? Count Olaf had appeared seemingly out of nowhere, and his shiny eyes glared at the children meaningfully. In one hand, Violet and Klaus could see he held a walkie-talkie. Just that we appreciate all you have done for us, Mr. Poe. That's all we want, Mr. Poe, Klaus said weakly. That's all we wanted to say. Of course, Mr. Poe said, patting him on the back. Well, Polly and I had better take our seats. Break a leg, Baudelaires. I wish we could break a leg, Klaus whispered to Violet, and Mr. Poe laughed. You will soon enough, Klaus said, pushing the two children toward the stage. Other actors were milling about, finding their places for Act 3, and just as Strauss was off in the corner, practicing her lines from her law book, Klaus took a look around the stage, wondering if anyone there could help. The bald man with the long nose took Klaus's hand and led him to one side. You and I will stand here for the duration of the act. That means the whole thing. I know what the word duration means, Klaus said. No nonsense, the bald man said. Klaus watched his sister in the wedding gown take her place next to Count Olaf as the curtain rose. Klaus heard the applause from the audience as Act 3 of The Marvelous Marriage began. It'll be no interest to you if I describe the action of this insipid, the word insipid here means dull and foolish, play by Al Funkoot, because it was a dreadful play, and all no real importance to our story. Various actors and actresses performed very dull dialogue and moved around the set as Klaus tried to make eye contact with them to see if they would help. He soon realized that this play must have been chosen merely for an excuse for Olaf's evil plan, and not for its entertainment value, as he sensed the audience losing interest and moving around in their seats. Klaus turned his attention to the audience to see whether any of them would notice that something was afoot, but the way the wart-faced man had arranged the lights prevented Klaus from seeing the faces in the auditorium, and he could only make out the dim outlines of people in the audience. Count Olaf had a great number of very long speeches, which he performed with elaborate gestures and facial expressions. No one seemed to notice that he held a walkie-talkie the entire time. Finally, just as Strauss began speaking, and Klaus saw that she was reading directly from the legal book. Her eyes were sparkling, her face flushed as she performed on stage for the first time. Too stage-struck to realize she was part of Olaf's plan. She spoke on and on about Olaf and Violet caring for each other in sickness and in health and in good times and bad, and all those things that are said to many people who decide, for one reason or another, to get married. When she finished her speech, Justice Strauss turned to Count Olaf and asked, "Do you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" "I do," Count Olaf said, smiling. Klaus saw Violet shudder. "Do you," Justice Strauss said, turning to Violet, "take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" "I do," Violet said. Klaus clenched his fist. His sister said "I do" in the presence of a judge. Once she signed the official document, the wedding was legally valid, and now Klaus could see that Judge Strauss was taking the document from one of the other actors and holding it out to Violet to sign. "Don't move an inch," the bald man muttered to Klaus, and Klaus thought of the poor Sonny dangling at the top of the tower and stood still as he watched Violet take a long quill pen from Count Olaf. Stood as he watched Violet take a long quill pen from Count Olaf. Violet's eyes were wide as she looked down at the document, and her face was pale, and her left hand was trembling as she signed her name. All right, so they did the play. Justice Strauss read from the legal book, making it legal. They both said, "I do," right? And she signed the document. So what does that mean? That means they're officially married. So Sonny should be safe now. They should be bringing her down. But, I mean, that's a horrible way to end, right? Well, luckily we have one more chapter. So let's see if it gets worse, better, same. All right, chapter 13. "And now, ladies and gentlemen," Count Olaf says, stepping forward to address the audience, "I have an announcement. There is no reason to continue tonight's performance, for its purpose has been served. This has not been a scene of fiction. My marriage to Violet Baudelaire is perfectly legal, and I am now in control of her entire fortune." There was gasps from the audience, and some of the actors looked at one another in shock. Not everyone, apparently, had known about Olaf's plan. "That can't be," Justice Strauss cried. "The marriage laws in this community are quite simple," Count Olaf said. "The bride must say 'I do' in the presence of a judge like yourself and sign an explanatory document. And all of you," here Count Olaf gestured up to the audience, "are witnesses." "But Violet is only a child," one of the actors said. "She's not old enough to marry." "She is if her legal guardian agrees," Count Olaf said. "In addition to being her husband, I am her legal guardian." "But that piece of paper is not an official document," Justice Strauss said. "That's just a stage prop." Count Olaf took the paper from Violet's hand and gave it to Justice Strauss. "I think if you look at it closely, you'll see it's an official document from City Hall." Justice Strauss took the document in her hand and read it quickly. Then, closing her eyes, she sighed deeply and furrowed her brow, thinking hard. Klaus watched her and wondered if this expression Justice Strauss had on her face whenever she was serving on the High Court. "You're right," she said finally to Count Olaf. "This marriage, unfortunately, is completely legal. Violet said 'I do' and signed her name here on this paper. Count Olaf, you are Violet's husband and therefore in complete control of her estate." "That can't be," said a voice from the audience, and Klaus recognized it as the voice of Mr. Poe. He ran up the stairs to the stage and took the document from Justice Strauss. "This is dreadful nonsense." "I'm afraid this dreadful nonsense is the law," Justice Strauss said, her eyes filling up with tears. "I can't believe how easily I was tricked," she said. "I would never do anything to harm you children, never." "You were easily tricked," Kalanoff said, grinning, and the judge began to cry. "It was child's play winning this fortune. Now, if all of you will excuse me, my bride and I needed to go home for our wedding night." "First, let Sonny go," Klaus burst. "You promised to let her go." "Where is Sonny?" Mr. Poe asked. "She's all tied up at the moment," Count Olaf said, and if you'll pardon the little joke. His eyes shone as he pressed the button on the walkie-talkie and waited while the hook-hand man answered. "Hello? Yes, of course it's me, you idiot. Everything has gone according to plan. Please remove Sonny from her cage and bring her directly to the theater. Klaus and Sonny have some chores to do before they go to bed." Count Olaf gave Klaus a sharp look. "Are you satisfied now?" he asked. "Yes," Klaus said quietly. He wasn't satisfied at all, of course, but at least his baby sister was no longer dangling from a tower. "Don't think you're so safe," the bald man whispered to Klaus. "Count Olaf will take care of you and your sisters later. He doesn't want to do it in front of all these people." He did not have to explain to Klaus what he meant by the phrase take care of. Well, I'm not satisfied at all, Mr. Poe said. This is absolutely horrendous. This is completely monstrous. This is financially dreadful. I'm afraid, however, Count Olaf said, that it is legally binding. Tomorrow, Mr. Poe, I shall come down to the bank and withdraw the complete Baudelaire fortune. Mr. Poe opened his mouth as if to say something, and he began to cough instead. For several seconds, he coughed into a handkerchief while everyone waited for him to speak. I won't allow it, Mr. Poe finally gasped, wiping his mouth. I absolutely will not allow it. I'm afraid you have to, Count Olaf replied. I'm afraid Olaf is right, Justice Strauss said through her tears. This marriage is legally binding. Begging your pardon, Violet said suddenly, but I think you may be wrong. Everyone turned to look at the eldest Baudelaire orphan. What did you say, Countess? Olaf said. I'm not your Countess, Violet said testily, a word here which means an extremely annoyed tone. At least, I don't think I am. And why is that? I did not sign the documents in my own hand, as law states, Violet said. What do you mean? We all saw you. Count Olaf's eyebrows was beginning to rise in anger. I'm afraid your husband is right, dear, Justice Strauss said sadly. There is no use denying it. There are too many witnesses. Like most people, Violet said, I am right-handed. But I signed my document with my left hand. What? Count Olaf cried. He snatched at the paper from Justice Strauss and looked down at it. His eyes were shining very bright. You're a liar, he hissed at Violet. Oh, she's not, Klaus said excitedly. I remember because I watched her left hand trembling as she signed her name. It is impossible to prove, Count Olaf said. If you like, Violet said, I shall be happy to sign my name again on a separate sheet of paper with my right hand and then with my left hand. You can see which signature the one on the document most resembles. A small detail like which hand you used to sign, Count Olaf said, doesn't matter in the least. If you don't mind, sir, said Mr. Poe, I'd like Justice Strauss to make that decision. Everyone looked at Justice Strauss, who was wiping away the last of her tears. Let me see, she said quietly and closed her eyes again. She sighed deeply, and the Baudelaire orphans and all who liked them held their breath as Justice Strauss furrowed her brow, thinking hard on the situation. Finally, she smiled. If Violet is indeed right-handed, she said carefully, and she signed the document with her left hand, then it follows that the signature does not fulfill the requirement of the nuptial laws. The law clearly states the document must be signed in the bride's own hand. Therefore, we can conclude that this marriage is invalid. Violet, you are not a countess, and Count Olaf, you are not in control of the Baudelaire fortune. Hooray, cried a voice from the audience, and several people applauded. Unless you're a lawyer, it will probably strike you as odd that Count Olaf's plan was defeated by Violet signing with her left hand instead of her right, but the law is an odd thing. For instance, one country in Europe has a law that requires all its bakers to sell bread at the exact same price. A certain island has a law that forbids anyone from removing its fruit. And a town not too far from where you live has a law that bars me from coming within 5 miles of this border. Had Violet signed the marriage contract with the right hand, the law would have made her a miserable contessa. But because she signed it with her left, she remained, to her relief, a miserable orphan. What was good news to Violet and her siblings, of course, was bad news to Count Olaf. Nevertheless, he gave everyone a grim smile. In that case, he said to Violet, pushing the button on the walkie-talkie, you'll either marry me again, and correctly this time, or I will. Nepo, Sonny's unmistakable voice rang out over Count Olaf's as she tottered on stage towards her siblings. The hook-handed man followed behind her, his walkie-talkie buzzing and crackling. Count Olaf was too late. Sonny, you're safe, Klaus cried, and embraced her. Violet rushed over, and the two older Baudelaires fussed over the youngest one. Somebody bring her something to eat, Violet said. She must be very hungry after hanging in a tower window all that time. Cake, Sonny shrieked. Arrgh, Count Olaf roared. He began to pace back and forth like an animal in a cage, pausing only to point a finger at Violet. You may not be my wife, he said, but you're still my daughter, and... Do you honestly think, Mr. Poe said in an exasperated voice, that will allow you to continue to care for these 3 children after the treachery I have seen here tonight? The orphans are mine, Count Olaf insisted, and with me they shall stay. There is nothing illegal about trying to marry someone. But there is something illegal about dangling an infant out of a tower window, Justice Strauss said indignantly. You, Count Olaf, will go to jail. and the 3 children are to live with me. Arrest him, a voice said from the audience, and other people took up the cry. Send him to jail. He's an evil man. Give us our money back. It was a lousy play. Mr. Poe took Count Olaf's arm, and after a brief eruption of coughs, and announced in a harsh voice, I hereby arrest you in the name of the law. Oh, Justice Strauss, Violet said, did you really mean what you said? Can we really live with you? Of course I mean it, Justice Strauss said. I'm very fond of you children, and I feel responsible for your welfare. Can we use your library every day? Klaus asked. Can we work in the garden? Violet asked. Cake! Sonny shrieked again, and everybody laughed. At this point in the story, I feel obliged to interrupt and give you one last warning. As I said at the very beginning of the book, your holding in your hand does not have a happy ending. It may appear now that Count Olaf will go to jail and the 3 Baudelaire youngsters will live happily ever after with Justice Strauss, but it is not so. If you like, you may shut the book this instance or stop this video and not read the unhappy ending that is to follow. You may spend the rest of your life believing that the Baudelaires triumphed over Count Olaf and lived the rest of their lives in the house and library of Justice Strauss. But that is not how the story goes, for as everyone was laughing at Sonny's cry for cake, the important-looking man with all the warts on his face was sneaking towards the controls for the lighting of the theater. Quick as a wink, the man flicked the main switch so that all the lights went off, and everyone was standing in the darkness. Instantly, pandemonium ensued as everyone ran this way and that, shouting to one another. Actors tripped over members of the audience. Members of the audience tripped over theatrical props. Mr. Poe grabbed his wife, thinking it was Count Olaf. Klaus grabbed Sonny and held her high as he could so she wouldn't get hurt. But Violet knew at once what had happened and made her way carefully to where she remembered the lights had been. When the play was being performed, Violet had watched the light controls carefully, taking mental note in case these devices come in handy for an invention. She was certain if she could find the switch, she could turn it back on. Her arms stretched in front of her as if she were blind, Violet made her way across the stage, stepping carefully around pieces of the furniture and startled actors. In the darkness, Violet looked like a ghost, her white wedding gown moving slowly across the stage. Then, just as she had reached the switch, Violet felt a hand on her shoulder. A figure leaned in to whisper into her ear. I'll get my hands on your fortune if it's the last thing I do, the voice hissed. And when I have it, I'll kill you and your siblings with my own 2 hands. Violet gave a little cry of terror, but flicked the switch on. The entire theater was flooded with white, and everyone blinked and looked around. Mr. Poe let go of his wife, Klaus put Sonny down, and nobody was touching Violet's shoulder. Count Olaf was gone. Where did he go, Mr. Poe shouted. Where did they all go? The Baudelaire youngsters looked around and saw that not only had Count Olaf vanished, but his accomplices, the wart-faced man, the hook-handed man, the bald man with the long nose, the enormous person who looked like neither a man or a woman, and the 2 white-faced women had vanished along with him. They must have run outside, Klaus said. While it was still dark, Mr. Poe led the way outside, and Justice Strauss and the children followed way down the block. They could see a long black car driving away into the night. Maybe it contained Count Olaf and associates. Maybe it didn't. But in any case, it turned a corner and disappeared into the dark city as the children watched without a word. Blast it, Mr. Poe said. They're gone. But don't worry, children. We'll catch them. I'm going to call the police immediately. Violet, Klaus, and Sonny looked at one another and knew that it wasn't that simple as that. Mr. Poe said Count Olaf would take care to stay out of the sight as he planned his next move. He was far too clever to be captured by the likes of Mr. Poe. Well, let's go home, children, Justice Strauss said. We can worry about this in the morning when I have fixed you a good breakfast. Mr. Poe coughed. Wait a minute, he said, looking down at the floor. I'm sorry to tell you this, children, but I cannot allow you to be raised by someone who is not a relative. What? Violet cried. After all Justice Strauss has done for us? We never would have figured out Count Olaf's plan without her and her library, Klaus said. Without Justice Strauss, we would have lost our lives. That may be so, Mr. Poe said, and I thank Justice Strauss for her generosity, but your parents' will is very specific. You must be adopted by a relative. Tonight you will stay with me in my home, and tomorrow I shall go to the bank and figure out what to do with you. I'm sorry, but that's the way it is. The children looked at Justice Strauss, who sighed heavily and hugged each of the Baudelaire youngsters in turn. Mr. Poe is right, she said sadly. You must respect your parents' wishes. Don't you want to do what your parents wanted, children? Violet, Klaus, Sonny pictured their loving parents and wished more than ever that the fire had not occurred. Never, never had they felt so alone. They wanted very badly to live with this kind and generous woman, but they knew that it simply could not be done. I guess you're right, Justice Strauss, Violet said finally. We will miss you very much. I will miss you too, she said, and her eyes filled with tears once more. Then they each gave Justice Strauss one last embrace, followed Mr. and Mrs. Poe to the car. The Baudelaire orphans piled into the back seat and peered out the back window at Justice Strauss, who was crying and waving at them. Ahead of them were the darkened streets where Count Olaf had escaped to plan more treachery. Behind them was the kind judge who had taken such an interest in the three children. To Violet, Klaus, and Sonny, it seemed that Mr. Poe and the law had made the incorrect decision to take them away from the possibility of a happy life with Justice Strauss, towards an unknown fate with someone unknown relative. They didn't understand it, but like so many unfortunate events in life, just because you don't understand it doesn't mean it isn't so. The Baudelaires bunched up together against the cold night air and kept waving out the back window. The car drove farther and farther away until Justice Strauss was merely a speck in the darkness, and it seemed to the children that they were moving in an aberrant, the word aberrant here means very, very wrong and causing much grief, direction. That's the end of it. That's the end of a series of unfortunate events, the bad beginning. So they proved him, they saved the day. They weren't married. Luckily, she signed up for her left hand. Remember, she was looking at her right hand a lot. She signed up for her left hand. Doesn't count. Baby got freed. All the adults agreed that there was no wedding, and did they live happily ever after? Well, only if you turn off the video when I told you to, and when the writer of the book told you to stop reading. Because what he learned was, not really. Count Olaf got away. They can't live with Justice Strauss like they wanted to, and they were going to go stay with Mr. Poe until he figured out what to do with them, which would be in book 2, which we will read sometime soon. I hope you enjoyed the book, and I'll see you later.